Welcome to the Wealth Podcast, Off With Your Coat, a podcast on women's health and wellness where we flip the script and ditch the surface level chatter. We need to ask the real questions. Let's get back to storytelling and back to basics to help us uncover how to set ourselves up for true health and wellness and pass it on. I'm Kat Duff, founder of GenWell, the women's health advocacy brand building wealth, the intersection of health and wellness. Some days it's me and a doctor, coat off, talking about what really matters. No fluff, no filters. Other days, it's East meets West, trading tools, not punches, to help move women's health forward. We're building generational wealth. Come with us. Coats off, let's go. Welcome back to Off With Your Coat. I'm your host, Kat Duff, and today I'm joined by Marina Pavlovic Rivas, co-founder and CEO of Eli Health. Marina's journey into hormone health started with a personal frustration, realizing how little access we have to one of the most important signals our bodies produce. That experience led her to build Eli Health, a company working to make hormone monitoring simple, instant, and part of everyday life. In this conversation, we talk about the future of personalized health, what hormones can tell us long before symptoms appear, and what it's really like building a company at the intersection of science, technology, and healthcare. She launched with cortisol, which is fascinating to learn more about. There is so much misinformation out there, and we really dive in deep. So I can't wait for you all to listen. Marina, off with your coat. Okay, guys, I am so psyched to have this conversation with Marina today of Eli Health. Everyone is talking about hormone balancing. We have 60 plus hormones. How are we meant to balance them all? And are we supposed to be balancing them? Like, how are we getting into this conversation? So, Marina, I am so thrilled to have you on Off With Your Coat. So thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Kat.
Of course. I just started doing my testing with Eli, so we'll have to dive into that later. But we always start the podcast with more of a personal story. I would love to know if you've had an aha moment about your own personal health journey or just something that's really shocked you about being a woman and learning about our bodies.
For sure. So before starting the company, so my background is in data science. So of course, I have that bias of liking to have data when it comes to make important decisions. But when I was not feeling at my best, feeling something was off and trying to put my finger on what's happening, I didn't have the information I wanted. And being more and more aware of the potential role of hormones and wanting to test that information, the process to get your hormonal levels is quite complex. You have to first get an appointment to see the doctor. Then the doctor has to agree to give you a requisition to get your hormone tested elsewhere. Then you have to go get that test physically at the lab, then wait for the result. So if you're lucky enough to have that whole process done, it can take, in some cases, close to 6 months.
Right.
Many months before you get the information, and some people don't even get it. So that was a realization that it shouldn't be like that because the information exists in my body. So why should I go through all of those steps to
Right.
get information that already exists within me? So then after digging and looking at the landscape and seeing that, yes, there are some places in the world, like in the US, where there is more and more availability of hormone testing, where you can order hormone test like you would order a t-shirt. That's amazing. And it's fantastic progress, but it was still not frequent enough to really match the moment where those changes happen. Because if you go online, you order that test, you get it home, you still have to wait to get it.
Right.
And then you still have to wait a couple days after you ship it back to get your information. So our vision was really to have something that is real time so that you can get the information inside of your body when that change happens, get the information right away and have guidance around what you can do about it. So that was really the whole vision. And with my co-founder, we realized that we each had a part of what could become a solution. But then to develop that solution, it took over 7 years of R&D to get that vision to reality.
Wow. What was your personal interest? Like, was there something going on with your hormonal health or something that you had like a vested interest in for this product?
Yeah, well, many different things. First, from cycle standpoint, like many women, I was seeing that why across different moments of the cycle, I feel more productive, than other? Why is my mood changing? Why is my level of energy changing? What am I doing that impacts those outcomes, to try to better understand what is it that I'm doing on this day when I'm feeling great, where it seems I'm changing nothing, but I'm feeling great. And that other day, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm not feeling great and I'm not feeling at my best. What is it that is changing? So from a, let's say, month-to-month standpoints, throughout the month, seeing that pattern that repeated, and therefore the insight that it must be to some extent related to hormones. And then speaking with a lot of women around that dynamic and realizing that I was far from being alone. And what I found extremely insightful during that initial kind of work, that where we spoke to hundreds of women and eventually thousands, that there was a lot of other life phases that I hadn't experienced yet. Like, for example, trying to conceive, being pregnant, being postpartum, going through perimenopause, that I hadn't have no visibility into, but where the stories were so similar around feeling something is either off, um, or that there's something underlying that shouldn't be that way, but not having the information to really put your finger on what's actually happening.
Yeah. I mean, and to back up even further from that, why data science? Like, how did you get into that? Have you always been the squeaky wheel?
For me, when I was younger, when I was a kid, I was more the artistic type, not necessarily uh, the numbers type of person, but I was always interested in information. So before doing a master's in data science, I was actually in communication, which can seem like two very different fields. But for me, it was the same goal of how do we get information and how do we share that information so that it's helpful for people. Communication is a lot about that. How do we find important information, or from a, let's say, big pool of information, how do we process it so that we extract the value from that information,
Mhm.
and how do we share it with people so that they can get the value from that information? Communication is a lot about that. And then through working in communication, I discovered the possibility to quantify when something is working or not. When you communicate, especially online, that you have data that can show you how it's being, the content, how people are engaging with the content, how many people are looking at the content. And that was really my first exposure to something that is closer, let's say, to data analytics. But in Montreal at the time, it was over 10 years ago, there was a lot happening around AI research. So a lot of meetups, also a lot of people getting together to speak about the potential of AI.
Yeah.
And I really felt in love with it, because my initial passion for communication being a lot around that extraction of value from the information and then sharing it with people. I saw in AI the possibility to do that at a scale and at a level of personalization
Mhm.
that would be impossible without those type of technologies and algorithm.
Right.
So for me, that was really what drove me to make the jump and go from that field that, let's say, was more close to art to one that's closer to science, but with that same vision. And that's what we do also at Eli. It's all about getting the information and putting it in the hands of people, but through AI in a way that's extremely personalized and very tailored to what you're actually trying to do and achieve.
Yeah. On the communications note, what we are seeing consistently is just I'm saying this because I'm a layperson. Someone coming in, looking at data, looking at a peer-reviewed study, and then they're disseminating incorrect information. They're
Uh-huh.
disseminating maybe misinformation where they're speaking out of scope. Maybe they're a chiropractor talking about hormonal health or preeclampsia. So, from your seat, how do you think social media is sort of a double-edged sword for women's health?
Wow, it's the whole discussion could be around that.
Yeah,
There's so much to
we'll do a second podcast episode.
there's so much to say there,
Yeah.
because there's different underlying dynamic, especially when we speak about social media. There's even the way that information is being disseminated, where the more you're interested in one topic, the more you get of that specific topic, what we call the bubble. So let's say you're interested around hormones, but then you start seeing some information that may be correct, but maybe not. For example, that one example of misinformation is that cortisol should always be lowered, which isn't true because it should be high in the morning and low in the evening. So first problem is that the information you get is not necessarily true. But then when you consume that information, there's different mechanism in the background that detect that you're interested in that topic and give you more of that topic. So then it can be very easy to think because you have this view into your feed that represents a very specific output of an algorithm, whereas where you look at the feed of someone else, it's completely different. But there's a risk of thinking, well, it must be true because I see it all the time. Everyone speaks about that. Everyone speaks around cortisol should be lowered. So then your worldview gets very influenced by this window that is not representative of a broader window. So very often it's a whole challenge to know what you don't know. And social media algorithms are not great at that. They're great at giving you more of what you said, not said, of what you've shown through behaviors that you're interested in, to give you more of that. But they're not great at expanding your horizon, or not great at distinguishing between what is real and what is not.
So, how can we empower women? Let's stick with cortisol for the moment because I know, you've launched with cortisol testing to start. How do we empower women to become more discerning and get out of that echo chamber when we're inundated that with social media and now with AI?
Well, social media, I still see that there's value in it. Sometimes it's just like the first, I would say, spark around being interested in a specific topic. But then there's different tools and different sources where people can dig deeper. And even within the social media landscape, looking at where the information is coming from. Is it just someone who speaks about the topic but has no really related background to it? Or is it, let's say, an endocrinologist that made it their life mission to get out of the doctor's clinic and share information that is accurate? There's a lot more and more doctors that have their accounts that share information that is peer reviewed, accurate, that is easy to understand because they're explaining it in a way that is meant to be for non-specialists. So really starting by looking at where the information comes from is a very interesting, I would say, first step. Before even digging into going to look at the research yourself, there's more and more tools that can help you do that more effectively. Even when we're thinking about AI, there's a lot of things that can be said around it, but it's still also an unprecedented tool in the way that people can dig in the research and have summaries that would.
Yeah. So, two questions on that. One, where do you see, in the last 7 years that you've been doing R&D, do you think we're making enough headway in women's health research? Where do you think we are right now?
There's certainly progress. We started the company more than 7 years ago. And at that time, there was, when we looked at, let's say, funded company, not really more than period tracking app. And even then, so not so much. And then since there was different trends where we started seeing more and more fertility companies getting funded, which is amazing. But then many voices started to speak up saying, yes, fertility is something we need to invest in. It's a super critical area of women's health, and not just women's health, of everyone's health. But women's health means much more than reproductive health. So can we also invest resources into those other areas? And that's something from a, let's say, industry standpoint, that we see more and more investments in those different areas of health and more investment in research as well. So that's big progress. But then the question is also, what's the rate of that progress? And many would say that it's still too slow. But directionally, it is evolving.
Yeah. I mean, I find it fascinating just how this research aspect for women's health is, in a way, mimicking how at least the US healthcare system had initially grown in this siloed way, which it still is to this day, where we have all these struggles, right, with the US healthcare system of no one's talking to one another. So
Mhm.
women historically have just had a harder time getting diagnosed. And I'm interested to see how all of this plays out with these incredible brands and female founders specifically that are coming out with things that are directly answering an issue that we have and that no one's addressed before. But we're still somewhat in these silos. So, like, how will all of the wearables come together? How will fertility not be treated, to your point, in a silo, but will be treated as just hormone health and metabolic health alongside perimenopause and all of these things? HRT just being hormone support for postpartum through anything. I'm just, that to me is so intriguing.
Mhm.
I'd love to know how you, or what was your experience with getting funding in the first place? Did you find it to be a struggle? Like, because you're not just testing for women, right? So tell me how that was.
Yeah, well, and even before going into that point, you make a great one around the silos that exist and how do we get all of that together. And how I see it is that it's normal that we have those silos to some extent because even doing something like we're doing, enabling people to get hormonal data continuously, longitudinally at a frequency that is unprecedented is something that takes a lot of time. For us, it was over 7 years of R&D, close to 30 million in funding total. So for one company to do that across all of the things that needs to be tackled would be completely unrealistic. But having those different companies tackle different gaps is something that we see happening more and more. But that's where AI, to the point I was sharing earlier, that enables unprecedented capabilities and information that is as a scale that's getting bigger and bigger because all of those tools are generating data. So for one person to be able to, let's say one doctor to digest all of that data, all of the data from a wearable, from a hormonal company like Eli, from full body scan and so on, it would take hours, if not days, for every patient, which would be completely unrealistic unless you have a tool that does so automatically. And that's one of the capabilities that AI is bringing. And one of the reasons why this consolidation of different silos is very realistic to expect in the next few years. And on the funding side, like probably any founders would tell you, especially in women's health, it was far from being easy. Probably besides R&D, one of the biggest challenge of the company. When we started, we were exclusively focused on women's health. It's more, I would say, after COVID that more and more awareness starting to emerge from men around hormones, with influencers like Huberman speaking about the role of cortisol and people understanding that it's not just hormones are not just a women's thing, that it impacts everyone. Same with testosterone that is starting to have a cultural moment, and men understanding the value of that. When we saw that more men were interested in using the product, which at that time was not yet on the market, but we saw that more and more we were getting questions around, can I use that product? Well, we expanded the company to a company that's able to provide information to everyone. So very often we see products and innovations being built for men and then applied to women. In her case, it was
Mhm.
the opposite. But
Right.
from a fundraising standpoint, it added the challenge that when you look at the landscape, and I don't know the exact numbers top of mind, but there's something like 2% managing partners in venture capital that are women. Depending on how you slice the number, sometimes it's higher, but it's in all cases a minority. So that brings the challenge that when you speak to the majority, you're speaking about a problem that they have never experienced. So it becomes much harder for them to understand the value of the product. And that's why perhaps when we look at our cap table, it's predominantly women, not only. We also have men on the cap table and as shareholders, but predominantly women, especially in the early days, because they are the ones who really understood the problem personally.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's just so frustrating that it's taking someone like Huberman to say, oh no, men have cortisol issues too, for people to listen. It's like, hi, we're struggling with this stuff all the time, and it's coming out in so many different ways. But I'm glad in your case that helped the situation by including men in sort of the testing cases. I'm also thinking about like the testosterone piece, and given, the Women's Health Initiative and the black box warning on HRT, it really like put a damper on testosterone research for women. And we're still in this sort of gray space of, yes, you'll have individual practitioners testing women for testosterone and saying, your libido's down, like you can't focus, like let's test your T levels so that we can help. And then we have to, do a specific cocktail of testosterone because it's not available to women. Like, in what world does that make sense, right?
For sure. And there's different dynamics that come into play when we look at what are the gaps in women's health. So funding is one of it, because if we want the innovations to be created by companies, they have to have the necessary research resources to do so. Same on the research side, where if you want that research to be conducted, it needs to be funded. But then there's other dynamics that sometimes arise from good intention, where with that study, unfortunately, it was interpreted in a way where it shouldn't have been. But doctors who were aware of that interpretation, which unfortunately again was biased, wanted to do good for their patients and not prescribe something that they thought would lead to increased risk of cancer. It's also a broader dynamic where the information is sometimes lacking from a research standpoint, but a broader dynamic too, that it takes time for medicine to adopt new insights, new standards of care. I've seen some information that it sometimes takes up to 19 years before they apply. And again, when you have the patient's health outcomes close to heart, you want to make sure you do your diligence. So it's slow, regardless of if it is women's health or not. But given we didn't have women's health research until recently, we still see that gap, like in any field, where between the moment where you get the result from a research to the moment where it gets translated to the actual practice, it does take time.
And then how do we apply that? Like, as we're looking at AI and more women are using that for just general day-to-day questioning, or, hey, I'm going to the OB, I'm having these symptoms, like what question should I be asking? So more of like an advocacy tool. How are those gender biases not showing up in AI, or they are? Like, how do we get around that?
Yeah, well, that could also be the a
Yeah.
topic for a full episode. But AI is trained on existing information.
Hmm.
So then the question is which information? But if, let's say, there's many credible sources, let's take the example of HRT, that there's many credible sources that mention that it can lead to an increased risk of cancer, then the AI will integrate those bias, because that data that is available and where the algorithm is being trained on says a specific thing. So there's the bias of the ones that exist in, let's say, the society or in the literature will be translated in the algorithms, because it's trained on what's being available.
Yeah.
So by design, those bias would exist. But then on the other end, the good news is because there's that possibility of digesting a lot of information versus, let's say, the previous way of Googling and getting different sources there. It wouldn't be realistic for someone before their doctor's appointment to go through all the information.
Right.
Versus with AI, it can be easier to surface the different point of views and to have that in mind to then dig deeper and prepare for a discussion. And more doctors are starting to adopt those tools as well, tools that are designed to help doctors dig into the literature more easily as
Yeah.
well.
What are your favorite AI tools?
I would say that when we look at the landscape, there's a lot of tools that are specialized and that we use in the company, for example, on the research side and so on, so on. But it's really hard to beat Claude from a, let's say, breadth of what's possible to do with a tool like that one. It's able to be generalized to so many things and so many processes, especially when you start using Claude Cowork and start being able to automate different processes or to automatically apply different goals that you're doing. I would say to me it's the most powerful one on the market.
Yeah. I'm getting ads for Perplexity all of the time. And like on a quick tangent aside from health, I'm just so fascinated because it pulls in all of the AI tools, but I'm like, how granular can we get here? Like maybe this is too much for me and I just need to stick with Claude or Chat or something.
Yeah. There's
So
so much capabilities even in Claude versus, let's say, just prompting
yeah.
regularly versus starting to use some of the other capabilities that start to connect with other processes. There's so much to get out of it, even by digging deeper into the same tool.
Yeah. So let's dive into hormones. Why did you launch with cortisol specifically?
Because cortisol, we launched with that hormones because when we look at the hormonal landscape and the role that hormones have on the body, I've heard someone said hormones is not a democracy and cortisol is the dictator. And it's true when we look at those biological processes that cortisol is a hormone that has an effect on almost everything else. To give an example, if your cortisol is too elevated, there's some research showing that even 20% elevation from the regular baseline can be enough for ovulation to not occur. So let's say someone who's trying to conceive and looking at reproductive hormones, which are the hormones that have an impact on that? Well, if cortisol is out of range, your efforts will not probably not lead to fruition. And same with other things like metabolic health, that you could be trying different things and not understanding why are you not able to lose weight, why are you hungry all the time. There's different reasons that can happen behind that, but one of them is that if cortisol is dysregulated, you'll have a much harder time achieving what you want to achieve because it has that wide impact on basically all systems of the body.
It is just so shocking to me with it, just in terms of I'm thinking of fertility and like I did a nido testing when I was trying to get pregnant with my daughter. It didn't really do anything with my son, just like ovulation tests, but no one is talking about cortisol and the impact on fertility. And granted, you're launching this testing capability, which is incredible. So I'm sure they just don't have access to that. But even like I was mentioning earlier, bringing everything together so you can connect the dots on your health is so important. I love that you're bringing that to the forefront of like all of metabolic health, not just for women, but just in general. It's amazing.
Yeah. And when we think, like, very often there's women that report the frustration of being in a process where they try to conceive and getting the feedback from the doctor, well, just try to be less stressed. And being like, well,
You're like, are you fucking kidding me?
thank you for the thank
Okay.
you for the advice, but first of all, like, how do I do that? And it's really rare. And again, based on very often how the system is designed and the fact that they have very limited time with every patient, it wouldn't necessarily be feasible for them to sit and really explain all the underlying processes that happens in the body. For example, sharing that when cortisol is too elevated, it can impact the goal through those different pathways. So first of all, having that understanding, but then also having the visit to be able to see, well, is it that? And being able to collect the data, measure your cortisol, see the trends. And once you see the trend, being able to not only understand what it means for you and your specific goal. We've spoken about trying to conceive, but same when you're trying to lose weight, you're trying to increase your athletic performance, you're trying to improve your sleep. So really understanding how your cortisol pattern impacts all of those goals, but also what can you do in order to get back to optimal cortisol levels and create that feedback loop. As you mentioned, it's all about connecting the dots because very often that research exists, but what was missing was the ability to see really currently in your body where it stands. Now it's possible through Eli, but really having all of that information at the same place and being able to create that feedback loop.
Yeah. And how does that differ? You know, I know in the app, for Ellie, as you're doing your testing, it asks if you're a female or male, like, what is that different threshold? What is that perfect sort of spike and fall throughout the day for a woman versus a man? Like, are there different numbers that you guys are testing against?
Yeah, so for cortisol, when we look at the existing research and existing papers on the topic, the current scientific understanding and medical understanding is that cortisol levels stay relatively stable through gender, through age. So the range that is considered the optimal range from a medical standpoint and clinical standpoint, it's the same range that is being applied across all gender, all age group. So that's the current understanding. But again, it was based very often on very, I would say, small scale data. Very often, although those results are reproducible across different groups, very often it was groups of 20 people, shorter period of time. And one of the things that we hope to bring with our product and the first longitudinal data set that we're creating is the possibility to go deeper and create not just the optimal reference range for the whole population, but create a reference range specific to you so that you're able to see over time based on your own baseline how that's evolved. So that's one, but also based on this data, potentially informing some more granular reference range that could take into account not just gender and age, but also different factor outside of the demographic ones.
So like PCOS or something of that
Exactly.
nature? Okay. Or
Exactly. PCOS.
PMOS. Yeah. Sorry. New name.
Yes. True. And other chronic conditions that can impact it as as well.
That's going to be amazing, as well as we're seeing this uptick in like perimenopause knowledge. I feel like that entire demographic, like Aura, just did their entire sort of perimenopause suite of knowledge. But I'm wondering, are there optimal cortisol levels? Do they change in these different life stages for women? Or do we not know that yet?
So based on the existing
Yeah,
published research, they stay
they
relatively
stay reactive. Okay.
consistent, but that's the reference ranges. But then when we dive deeper, including in the existing research, we see that different things impact cortisol levels, and that cortisol levels also impact different things. So it's kind of a bidirectional process where, let's say, if you have chronic pain, let's say you have a condition that affects women differently or predominantly that creates pain. Pain and chronic pain can have an impact on cortisol levels. And then those dysregulated cortisol levels can have also an impact on different areas of health. So it is documented that for perimenopause, cortisol levels that are out of range can have an impact on the presence of different symptoms, but also their frequency and their intensity. So that's why when we look at what's considered the optimal range in the population, that's one question. But then when we look at all of the things that can impact cortisol levels and all of the things that cortisol levels impact, there are so many that it's almost impossible to find someone that doesn't have one of those factors
Right.
that impacts that bidirectional relationship. And when it comes to perimenopause, when there's so many changes that happens in the body, it is directly tied to cortisol in various ways.
Yeah. So tell me more about the testing. We know it's saliva based, but what was your thought process in, for example, when I go to the doctor and I get my annual labs, they're like, your cortisol's fine. I'm like, you measured me on a random Tuesday and I was fasted in one time of the day. Like, to me, that makes zero sense.
Yeah.
Walk me through the why behind the frequency of testing, the lift for women as they're doing this testing, and like how that factors into building that, snapshot over time.
Yeah. Well, first of all, when most doctors look at cortisol, like any angle that they'll try to look at, their goal or they're trained to find disease state. So not
Mhm.
trained to proactively optimize something or look at the wellness angle, including the health angles. More and more doctors are doing it, especially doctors in let's say longevity, where under that big umbrella of longevity doctors, there's doctors from all fields, endocrinology, cardiology, any field, including women's health, that go under that umbrella and that look at things differently. But they remain a minority versus let's say the broader population of doctors. So when they say your cortisol is normal, it's normal through the lens of that disease state, so that you're unlikely to, or that we can confirm that you don't have a cortisol related disease like additions or cautions, that you don't have one of those conditions.
Today at 8 a.m.
Well,
only.
with those conditions, usually it's
Right.
consistent over time. So you wouldn't know unless some more, let's say, cyclical cautions, for example, that introduce some of those longitudinal or time-based dynamics. But for most conditions, you would know it with a screening test like this one. But that's one area of the question. Do I have a certain cortisol-related conditions? Which for most of the population, the answer will be no. But then when we look at the more, let's say, wellness angle and preventative health angle and performance angle, does cortisol have an impact on all of those areas? Yes. And it has been demonstrated in research again and again. And that's where, from an infrastructure standpoint, doctors have access to doctors and more companies like Function Health, Superpower, and so on. They're doing a great job at making those blood tests more widely accessible at a lower cost, more convenience, that you can go to your pharmacy and get the result directly online and get some interpretation. So that's really amazing. But that's for some biomarkers that don't require that level of frequency. With cortisol, that changes throughout the day. And not only just throughout the day, but based on the moment when you woke up, the curve where it's supposed to be high in the morning and go back down in the evening, it all starts when you wake up. So let's say if you're someone who wakes up at 5 a.m. versus 10 a.m., the curve starts at very different moment of the day. So that's the other challenge when, if you're taking a simple data point, not only is it not the complete picture, but it means very different things based on those other variables, like when you woke up. So when we created the company, it was all about how can we develop a technology that match the frequency of what's happening inside for hormones. So when we look at cortisol, that it fluctuates throughout the day and every day, then the question was, how can we create a technology that is, we had two benchmarks: as easy as brushing your teeth, because you need to integrate it into your routine, and as affordable as a cup of coffee, so that it's something you can do often. So that was really the lens we used to develop the product. At first, we were agnostic, but we ended up choosing saliva for various reasons, but including the fact that you need to be able to measure often throughout time to really solve ultimately that gap of getting the data at the frequency that matches the hormonal events that happen in your body.
Yeah. Is there ever a world in which you would recommend to someone to test more frequently? So, for example, if they're fasting and they fast until noon, because that can have an impact, or they change their nutrition and they are maybe, let's say, on like the autoimmune protocol or something, like, are there ways that women can work with their doctors to possibly utilize the technology in a more advanced way too?
For sure. So that was also part of the requirements that we had around what the technology should be able to do, that it should be able to deliver as many data points as we want and need. So we recommend as a base protocol for users to test once in the morning and once in the evening, because again, there's that curve that's called the diurnal curve, that where it's supposed to be high in the morning and low in the evening. So it fluctuates throughout the day. But by having those two data points, we're able to have a good visibility into that curve and around the slope of that curve, which is important information. So it gives most of the information where we can deliver what it means for them, and then repeat that frequently enough over time so you can create that feedback loop. But then in some cases where people want to see how different actions that they're doing within a day has an impact on cortisol. So you've mentioned fasting, but another example, it's athletes where they want to see more granular data. Then it's possible to test even more frequently. So we see even organically, a lot of our users have those specific goals or insights that they're trying to get and understand, and they build their own protocol based on that knowledge that they have. But more and more, we're interested in working with doctors, with clinics, with professionals that have their own protocols already, and where people are working with those professionals to get to a specific outcome, but where what's missing is the measurement. So that's really what we deliver as a company.
Yeah.
Is the frequent and longitudinal, and we could even call it continuous measurement of hormone that enables to support those protocols.
Yeah. Do you test yourself?
All the time.
Okay. What have you learned?
I've learned so much. For example, you were just speaking about fasting. That's something I was doing, intermittent fasting. And for some time, it was working very well for me. I was stopping to eat around 4 p.m. In the afternoon and then having breakfast around 7 a.m. And I felt that my nights were getting better and so on. So for some time, I was on that protocol and things were going well. And then at some point, I started waking up at 3 a.m. Frequently.
There she is. There's the cortisol.
And I didn't change anything. That protocol, I was doing it for some time. So it's not the first thing I suspected, given it was not a recent change. But given I have such easy access to cortisol data, during the night, I tested myself and saw that peak that's supposed to happen in the morning was happening in the night. So my whole rhythm got shifted too early. And by changing back that time frame of eating, my cortisol came back to optimal. So that's one example. But then as a founder, like many people who are building companies or athletes that want to really push to the limit, and that definition of limit to have it higher and higher all the time, it's really helpful to have kind of that internal dashboard and see when that push you're doing is having an impact on your body.
Mhm.
Because we all intuitively kind of understand what high cortisol could mean, high stress, but we've seen very often, and I've seen it in my data too, cortisol levels in the morning that start to be too low. And that is an early sign of burnout. So being able to see that trend before it gets there,
Yeah.
seeing cortisol level decline, for me very often was a signal of like, okay, I need to readjust something in order to keep
Yeah.
it to optimal. So I've used it as a internal dashboard. I use it still all the time for this.
I was just looking at mine because I was telling you that my starting cortisol the last 2 days was very low. So that is also interesting. So when you were fasting, for example, so it was spiking at 3 a.m. and then at 7 a.m., let's say it was low, and
Yeah.
then it was low again in the evening.
Mm-hmm.
So as a use case for someone that thinks they're perimenopausal, that maybe can test themselves at 2 or 3 a.m. when they're waking up. If their cortisol is not spiking, how is that a signal for them to look for something else? What could that be? And then if it is spiking, how do we make this data actionable for them? So if they're not fasting, like how do you start that process of either eliminating lifestyle choices, or do you focus on one to test and learn with the app? How would you suggest that?
Yeah, well, there's so many things that can influence health. So let's say someone who's not sleeping well, there's other hormones like progesterone. Often it's a hormone that's called the calming hormone. And when it's out of balance, it can have a lot of impact on sleep. And there's different options that people can, let's say if it's progesterone that's problematic, different options including HRT that can be implemented. So it's in many cases it's a process where you need to do different things to get to the root cause. But what is true is that when we look at the literature and the broad role that cortisol has around different areas of health, that when you see so you can visualize it as a different trend that cortisol can have, or a different, let's say, signature, where it can be the optimal pattern where it's high in the morning, low in the evening. It can be the flat pattern. It can be the elevated pattern where it's always high. It can be the inverted pattern where it's too low in the morning, high in the evening. And each of those patterns have been linked in existing research to different symptoms and also different outcomes, that if those patterns exist in you, they're linked to those different health outcomes that are likely to occur. So it's kind of you can see it as a metric that when you optimize it, it's not only one stone, two birds, it's one stone, dozens of birds. because it has an impact on all
Mhm.
of those other areas of health. So what is more interesting for people and who want to test their cortisol is not necessarily those random data points. It's more being able to test in the morning, test in the evening, and see what that curves look like to be able to understand how it links to those.
Mhm. And I mean, the test is awesome. I had like a visceral reaction when I saw the first test that I had taken because it has, you can't see it right now, it has two pink lines. And I was like the last time I saw that. But it's so easy to do. And so, someone like me, that is just sort of a reminder. It's like, I feel like sometimes I have all the tools, I know what I need to do, and I'm not implementing it. Maybe I've just
Yeah.
had a super stressful couple of months. Something's happening. We were just talking about moving. Like there's some little blip where I need to get my ass back in gear. And so for me, I'm like, oh God, my cortisol is low. Okay, I need to start investigating and digging deeper and just like get back on what makes me feel good because I know that I'm waking up and I can't wake up. Like I know that I'm feeling all of the things. So what are some of those, I guess, proactive lifestyle supportive things that women can do to just support that natural curve for cortisol?
Yeah, so there's many different things that can be done across basically all areas of a
Yeah.
lifestyle intervention. But one helpful way to think about it is cortisol is a rhythm that has to happen in a certain, let's say, trend. That high in the morning, low in the evening, and that has to happen at a specific moment as well. So when you wake up until the moment where you go to sleep. So a lot of the actions are not only the actions that you do, but when you do it. The time bound aspect is very important. So, for example, light exposure is something that is very easy and in many cases free and accessible. So that's very important, but that has to be done at a certain moment. So ideally, in the first 10 minutes where you wake up and mid-morning, midday, so around noon, and in the evening, making sure that you don't have a lot of light that can be tricking your brain in another direction than where it needs to be. So, for example, avoiding blue light in the evening so that you can recreate that circadian rhythm, the rhythm of how your system in your body should be evolving throughout the day. We spoke about fasting,
Mhm.
but fasting is an example of how an action like eating, when you do it, how it can have an impact on that rhythm. So being
Mhm.
mindful of when you eat, trying to have a consistent meal in terms of timing. Same with sleep wake cycle. At the moment where you go to sleep and the moment you wake up, trying to have that being consistent throughout time is very important as well. And same with other actions like sports. We all know that exercising is great, but we've seen very often in our user base, people and women saying, well, I'm doing everything right. I'm fast. I'm exercising. I'm doing all of those things, but yet like my cortisol is still I
Right.
still don't feel great. And then when they see they have high cortisol and they're able to kind of backtrack and understand that, well, perhaps fasting is not great for you, or perhaps you can do it intermittently, but shift the window a bit. And perhaps exercise, not perhaps exercise is great for your health, but if you do high intensity exercise in the evening, then it's not having a great impact on your cortisol. So if you really want to do that high intensity exercise, do it in the morning, and perhaps you're going through a phase where your cortisol is very elevated and we're considering other types of exercise like weightlifting or other exercise that don't have that kind of spiking effect on cortisol can be something you prioritize.
And how quickly does, you know, putting something to effect change your cortisol level? So if I was consistently doing high intensity 7 days a week and maybe I shifted to like 3 days doing more gentle exercise, like how soon will you start to see changes in your cortisol or should you?
Yeah, well, it can be almost instant. So, for example, if you do high intensity exercise, or let's say you do a run, if you test your cortisol after, if you're beyond, let's say, a zone 2 run shouldn't be spiking your cortisol, but let's say you're higher than that, you should expect a cortisol spike, and that spike is almost instant, about maybe 20 minutes after the activity starts. Same for the things like cold plunges, heat exposure. 20 minutes is about the time where you'll see that impact. But then if you're having an optimal rhythm, you should see those levels get back down relatively quickly. So if you test a couple hours after, it should be down. Let's say you test the same evening, it should be back down. And that's where it gets more complicated, because if someone has different stressors, which for most people, it's really just one thing, it's a combination of things. And if that stress and that load has been chronic, that's where it can take a bit more time. Where, let's say, you do that high intensity exercise, which for someone optimal should get back down. But if you're experiencing those different factors, it could stay elevated, and sometimes we see that this impact stays for a prolonged period of time, and then it compounds. So it can be anywhere that you see the change, from a few minutes to some people it takes longer. It can take many months because it requires the work to be done on many fronts. And that's why, given the length of time it can take for many people, it's important to see not only the absolute level, but to see the progress, and to see maybe your levels are still too low in the morning than what they should be, but are they trending up, or are they staying flat? So that's really that directionality over time too, that is very important, in addition to like the absolute level.
And then if you've elevated cortisol or too low cortisol for a significant period of time, what sort of disease states can that lead to?
Well, it's been shown in research that those different dysregulated pattern have an impact on many different things. So it can be metabolic health, for example. We spoke about how that can be linked to difficulty being hungry all the time, having difficulty losing weight, how it can lead to challenges in terms of fertility, how it can increase the frequency and intensity of different symptoms related to perimenopause. But it's also true for that it can aggravate the symptoms and intensity of symptoms across many different chronic conditions. But it goes as far as being linked to increased risk of all-cause mortality, because given that cortisol has such a big impact on all different areas of the body, it's ultimately an aggravating factor, stress, and the impact of stress on different condition.
Yeah, the
And under
inflammation. Yeah.
exactly, on when, if they would appear or not, and when they would appear and to which intensity. Stress and cortisol have a big impact on almost all of those all areas of health. And then it's true for different life phases, like during pregnancy. It has a big impact on the health of the mother. But what I've been fascinated to learn is that it not only has an impact in the case of pregnancy on you, but also on the health outcomes of your child once they're born. So it's powerful enough to even be a predictor of not only your health, but also the health of your children. So it really has that wide reaching impact.
Yeah. Loosely connected to that is like the other sort of black box, I guess, fear mongering that's happening is to put that on SSRIs for women who are pregnant, which is like such bullshit, in my opinion. Obviously, it's not a medical opinion, but just from that exact reasoning of like, however you can support women and help mitigate some of that stressor on her body, giving her an opportunity or an option for an SSRI in pregnancy because it is clinically safe and it's safe for the baby, lessen the load. So I'm wondering, like, how does, like, obviously cortisol and the stress has an impact on anxiety, but how does that sort of come to play, in sort of all of your hormonal health?
Yeah, well, that's a complex dynamic, because it involves, is it pre-existing
Right.
dynamic? Is it something that arises just during the pregnancy? And very often, many women will relate. We've heard so often women going through perimenopause and feeling a certain way, and then being told, well, it's likely depression, just like fix that part, when in fact it's hormonal dynamic that leads to that. So those would be one of the cases where having actual medical support would be required to really try to distinguish between what can be potentially arising from a biological imbalance versus, is everything biologically optimal and there's other things happening in parallel.
Yeah.
So really making the distinction there. But cortisol has it's been a long time that research from, let's say, the more psychiatric angle leverages cortisol as a biomarker as it relates to depression and burnout. So it is informative of that state or someone trending towards that state. But then why is someone in that state? Sometimes by optimizing the cortisol levels, let's say you have a flat curve and due to different factors, you work on those factors, it's very possible that you'll feel better on different fronts, including mentally and emotionally. But it's possible too that there's other things that are going on and that require medical intervention or different types of support from different specialists.
On that note, what's your thought about like the emerging research on gut health and the role that it plays with hormones? And are you seeing that as any sort of additional point of entry for what you're doing?
Yeah, well, it's gut health. It's fascinating. That's not our area of expertise as a company, but from what I've seen personally around how it touches so many aspects of your health and how by changing your gut microbiome, you can impact different outcomes. It's a very exciting field of research because ultimately we're humans, but when you realize that as a human, you're also composed of those different living organisms and that you have a possibility to influence what those living organisms are and how they influence different aspects of health, it's really fascinating.
Yeah. And so you're sitting on this incredible repository of data right now for women specifically. Are you seeing any patterns in, I know that there's like lifestyle components you can enter into the app. Do you have access to that? And so are you seeing any patterns in maybe women are doing cold plunge and their cortisol is super high? Like any data you can share that has been really shocking or interesting to you?
Yeah, well, there's different things that we've been seeing that we find interesting, and so far that data was collected, let's say, in a more like unstructured way where people test their cortisol. They have the ability to log different tags so that we can then make those correlations. So it's still like from a, let's say, research standpoint, things that we cannot make firm conclusions about. Although something I'm really excited about as a founder and for our company is that we're starting to do that research more and more in a structured way. We have someone full-time, fully dedicated full-time in the company to publishing research out of this database, but also doing collaboration with the different researchers in the field so that we can leverage it in a way where we can make those more, let's say, definitive conclusions. But we've seen, just to give a few examples, that things like, let's say, you've mentioned cold plunges. Same goes with heat exposure, that there's a response that is very often individualized, that the same action will have different impact on different people, including within, let's say, the female group, where, let's say, for some people doing a cold plunge or a sauna session can actually spike their cold. For some others, it can actually lower it, let's say in the evening where it should be low. And for some people it's high, that it has that lowering impact. And for some people it's neutral. And that's actually consistent with what we see in research, that there's that notion of like being adapted to heat or being adapted to cold, where we see this actually in our data. So there was a lot of those, let's say, things that have been demonstrated in research that's been interesting to see that with that unstructured data collection, we're still able to, detect in the data. But what we're mostly excited about is creating new understandings that were not possible to get without that data. So that's the next chapter that we're currently working on.
It's really cool. And then what's next in terms of hormones? What's the next one up?
So we have testosterone and progesterone coming up. So two hormones that we're extremely excited about and for which there's a lot of demand.
I mean, and like I mentioned earlier, the testosterone for women, because doctors are not they're not testing for it. They're not asking women because they don't know what to do on the other end. So that's fantastic. I'm very excited for the progesterone as well because I have PMDD and this is like kind of creepy, but I've recently started getting like hallucinations right before my period. So that progesterone drop
Yeah.
creates this really lifelike hallucination where someone's trying to get me at my bedside for like 1 or 2 nights. And then, I mean, I'll have to, throw the LE test in my mouth at some point to see how my cortisol is also working in tandem with that. But knowledge is power. I guess the last question I have on that is how much is too much? As you're thinking of women, we're so busy. You've made it really easy with Ellie because you're just testing twice a day. And as you said, cortisol right now, like that's the dictator. A lot of women that are going to functional medicine experts, they're being sold like Dutch tests, right? Which again is like one snapshot in time. What's your take on Dutch tests?
I think it can be a relevant tool to get information, but then it's the question is always what information you're trying to get. Some questions can be answered with a snapshot, and some questions need that longitudinal data set. So more and more we're hearing about continuous hormone monitoring, and there's a lot of debate around like what actually constitutes continuous versus not. And even when we look at tools, let's say smart watches and smart rings, they're not truly in the sense that they measure without interruption. Sometimes it's every 15 minutes, sometimes it's every minute, but there's no such tool that is like truly continuous, because even if you would measure every second, you don't measure every millisecond. So to me, it's not the question about is it continuous or not, is a snapshot enough or not. It's really to start with what is the thing you're trying to answer, and the biological processes that happen, on which time frame and frequency do you need to capture them to answer the question. So, for example, it wouldn't make much sense to do a continuous pregnancy test. Most of the time, maybe during some times you would want to have that information much more frequently, but for most people, it's information that you would want to get at some specific time frame. And same goes for other hormones, where one snapshot can be more than enough. Let's say once a year or twice a year can be more than enough. But for other analytes, including hormones like cortisol, you cannot really answer the question without having it at that frequency over time. So that's why tools like Dutch tests and other tests, I still think they have their place in the landscape, but you just have to be aware of what is it that you're trying to answer. And when it comes to cortisol, if you don't have that frequency over time and that longitudinal view, by default, you'll have an incomplete answer.
Yeah, I think that's just a great tip for women too, because we're obviously constantly looking for just answers to what's happening in our bodies. And I just have tons of friends that are getting these Dutch tests and they're like, why? I don't know why I'm getting it. I don't know what the reasoning is. What are they testing? And then it comes back and they're like, oh, my hormones they're off. Is there one thing in your mind where you would say, oh, yeah, this is a good use case for a Dutch test or any of the equivalent sort of snapshot hormone tests?
I would say when it comes to hormones, there's that longitudinal aspect. So for me, hormones are part of the biomarkers where having that visibility over time is required. And so a tool like a Dutch test would be, in many cases, a good first view, but that should be followed with more frequent testing to see how that is evolving over time.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this. I think it's tremendous. Last question, and then we'll go into some final thoughts, is just in the wearables tech aspect. Is there anything that you also personally use or anything that you're excited about that's emerging?
Yeah, well, in terms of wearable, I use actually more than one. I use Whoop and Oura. Of course, being in this space, I like to
All
have
the data.
different data sets. So it's interesting to see how they often differ in terms of insight for the same type of metrics like sleep, for example. So those are the ones that I use frequently. But in the, let's say, broader wearable space, there's a lot of movement happening on the research side, but to this day, very little actually goes to the market, and that's normal. I've mentioned how it took more than 7 years for us to get on the market. Same will be true with some of those other emerging wearables, but more and more we'll see the capability of measuring different aspects of health frequently over time.
Yeah. What was the biggest sort of disparity between Whoop and Aura for you with sleep?
I see that very often Oura will be, let's say, less severe than Whoop, where On the Whoop side, very often it would be in the yellow, when in the other it's good. Same for things like recovery. So I find the URA data much easier to, I would say, digest. So someone who's just starting with wearable, it's a good one to start. But I do find the Whoop data very often like more granular and
Yeah.
reflective of how I actually feel.
Whoop is more of the alarmist or maybe a little bit more sensitive, or as like the gentle friend, like, you're okay, you're fine.
And it's really interesting to evaluate that too, based on what's your goal. For example, Whoop, very often when you're training, it gives a better view on the strain that you're having on your training and so on, but also your personality. And that's something that's not discussed as much. But if you're someone who's looking for, let's say, more like you said, that friend that's tapping you on the back and saying like things
You've
are
got it,
going to be
girl. Yeah.
fine. It's not the night of sleep is not great, but you'll work through it. The different voices of those wearables, for example, Garmin being seen as the even more strict one.
Yeah.
That's also something to keep in mind. Your psychology and how you want your wearable to talk to you.
Yeah. Oh,
There's
that's so
a lot
funny.
of differences.
Which one can I share with them that I'm a Gemini, and they'll take that into consideration?
That's not yet a feature I've seen in the market.
Let's work out the kinks on that one. My health could be very different depending on which personality side I'm in, so you never know. So I guess last question is, as women are thinking now more about longevity and how I can be really my healthiest version of myself throughout my health span, how do hormones play the biggest role, not just cortisol, but why should we be doing continuous hormone monitoring for longevity?
Yeah, well, again, because it touches all areas of health, not just it touches it on the short term, so how you feel on a daily basis, but it's also linked to future health outcomes. So hormonal levels that are not optimal, yes, will have an impact on how you feel today, but will also have an impact on those future health outcomes, physical, but also mental, cognitive, things like bone health. Also, it really touches everything. So, in a preventative health approach, um, it's really one of the lens that has a major impact. And of course, there's a lot of things that can be done from a lifestyle standpoint. And that's where we focus as a company, things that you can do once you know your hormonal levels, that you can do at home, lifestyle based. But then in many cases, including when people progress in life, having other tools like hormone replacement therapy can have a major impact, including in preventing a lot of those potential conditions. When we think, for example, of when estrogen is not optimal, how we can impact bone health. And then if your bone health is not optimal, and if you have a fracture, how it reduces your mobility and increases your risk of mortality. So there's all those different loops that happen, and being proactive about it can have a major impact.
Yeah, cardiovascular health.
Mm,
I mean, the bone density thing is so intriguing to me. I was just talking to a doctor who is in her early 40s, and she went to a concierge medicine practitioner who gave her a DEXA scan just as part of the protocol. And she has osteopenia. She's
yeah,
41. I had another internist who tested a 31-year-old who had osteoporosis. Like,
yeah,
how on earth haven't we connected to those dots, and we have, DEXA scans in our 60s when our bone mass is peaking when we're 20? Like, thank God
exactly.
for women, because you're doing it. You're finding the holes and we're putting them together. So thank you for that. It's incredible. Just some more fun questions for you. What are you doing for your own health and longevity? Like, what are some of your favorite wellness things that you incorporate into your day-to-day basis?
So I love the basics, and especially being in the health and wellness space. There's always something new, always a new protocol, always something you can try. Sometimes, very often, things that are unproven. So there's different mindsets there. There are people that want to be early adopters on those things. I'm more focusing on the basics all the time, making sure I eat well, making sure I sleep enough, making sure I exercise, and doing those things consistently, keeping stress under control. That to me has, and not just to me, the research has been sharing it. I've heard a longevity doctor said who was sharing once that they work with the wealthiest people on earth who have the money and resources available to try those ultra niche interventions. But how you can see it like a pyramid, and those based lifestyle interventions are really the thing that provide 95% of the benefits. And then when you have that under control, you can focus on what are the things that can give you that extra 5%. But I always see it that if I'm not doing those basic things, I won't be adding something new.
Yeah. We always say the unsexy basics are foundational. You have to lead with them.
Exactly.
What do you do for stress management?
For me, I love being in nature. So just even taking a 5-minute walk, taking that time to be outside is to me one of the quick things I have access to. And we've just moved our office now where we do all the R&D and manufacturing. But I bring some of those things, like when I take a step back and say, why do I like being in nature? Because there's that light exposure. So the office that we chose, there's almost 360 windows from floor to ceiling. So you have a lot of that natural light inside. We brought a lot of tall trees inside. So you have that feeling of the actual greenery. But that to me is always an easy and accessible thing.
Yeah, I love it. What's your favorite personal care product? It could be makeup, personal care, anything that makes you feel good.
I don't have one specific in mind, but when it comes to personal care, something I'm always looking at deeply is making sure it's free of endocrine disruptors. Of course, being hormone aware, endocrine disruptors, so different ingredients that have an impact on the hormones, it's something to really look into. So I make sure that all my products are fragrance free and free of.
Do you use any of like the cleaner fragrances for perfumes or anything? Or are you just like, oh, natural?
I believe that there's no such thing as a clean fragrance.
Okay.
By default.
Yeah.
When there's a fragrance. And of course, like sometimes there's different things like natural oil and some of those other avenue that could be cleaner. But I have the bias that I don't think we can call it an allergy, but fragrances give me headaches.
Oh, yeah.
And skin reactions. So from my own personal standpoint of having that kind of dual reaction, both headaches and skin reactivity, even the fragrances that are quote unquote clean, I see those reactions. So even if it's maybe possible for other people to use fragrances in a way that have no endocrine disruption, my personal
you're like not it.
Yeah, for me, the risk versus the reward is not worth it. So I adopt a zero fragrance approach.
Totally get it. So will you go into an Uber?
For me, that's it's so hard to find a Uber without, when you can put those preferences like no music.
Yeah, where's the Christmas
no
tree
fragrance
one?
I'm really looking forward to it.
Okay, Uber, we need to figure this out. You need to have like a section that's like, car freshener, air freshener free or something. I once went and we were in Utah. I was with my husband and I was newly pregnant. So I was already feeling nauseous. This car had 6 plugins, a multitude of like ones that are hanging from the dashboard. I got in and I literally was like, all the windows down. It was like 19 degrees out Fahrenheit. I'm like, put all the windows down. I'm like, I'm going to die. I will throw up. It's not a good situation.
No,
so
it's
I feel you on that. So we'll start a memo to Uber and Lyft and all those guys. Last question: podcast, book, or resource that you would recommend to women?
There's so much. That's a tough one.
It doesn't have to be health related. It can be like my current favorite show is Off Campus. I don't know if you've seen that on Amazon Prime. Can't recommend it enough.
No, but one that a podcast that I find is really accessible. It's been some time that I don't listen to it, but Diary of a CEO. I find that very often they invite some of those emerging scientists and doctors that are starting to have a platform where they want to share that information, more, let's say, emerging information. So it's one where there's very often relevant health and wellness information, especially when you're interested in seeing what's, let's say, emerging, but at the same time in a way that's easier to digest.
Yeah.
Specialize
More
it.
approachable.
Yeah.
Right. That's my kind of thing. That's why we're doing this show. It's just like how can we get fantastic founders like yourself in front of women to share what's actually happening and to connect with you, because it's so important for us to share our stories as women with our own, health experiences, with our foundership, with all of that. So congratulations on everything. Eli Health is certainly taking off, and I'll have to text you over the next couple of weeks to make sure that my cortisol is back on track. But I'll definitely document it. So where can folks find you, connect with you, learn more about Eli, test it out, sign up for the subscription, all of it?
They can go simply on our website, which is eli.health. So not eli.com, eli.health. Very simple to remain.
Amazing. Thank you guys for listening. This has been an incredible episode. I can't wait for you all to start learning more about your bodies, your cortisol, your hormones, and we will see you next week.